Welcome everyone to the first of our three survey webinars. Today's is a brief introduction to survey research and survey instrument design. I'll be going through some of the slides with you. I'm Claire Devine. I'm a research associate at CORE. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be joined by my colleague, Sarah. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Roth. I'm a research scientist here at CORE. I use she, her pronouns, and excited to be talking about surveys with you all today.
Great. If you want to go to the next slide. So these are just our objectives for today, kind of around what we want to talk about surveys, understanding when surveys are most useful and appropriate, reviewing the stages of conducting a survey, identifying best practices for designing and distributing that survey. And then we're going to have an activity kind of in the, well, nearish the end, but in the middle, where we critique questions from existing surveys and take an opportunity to compare them to your own survey experience and do a little bit of a compare and contrast there. So we'll start with some introduction, including some poll questions just to see where folks are at when it comes to distributing surveys. We'll launch into the survey cycle and a little bit of an overview, including developing the survey instrument and distributing it once you've created it. We have that activity that I just described, and then we'll end with just a couple of quick slides around data analysis, interpretation, and dissemination. We do like to start with a land recognition. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. This session is presented today on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. We just want to take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brought us here together today. And this is a good time also to do some introductions. As I said, I'm Claire Devine, use she, her pronouns with CORE, and I'm on the indigenous lands of the Walla Walla and the Umatilla, as well as others. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat and give those as well, your name and pronouns, organizations, and indigenous lands. If you don't know what indigenous lands you're on, this is a really cool website where you can enter your location and get that information. So it's right there. And we do want to take this moment while people are putting their names in the chat to say that obviously land acknowledgement is not enough. It's just a starting point. Something to ask yourself is, how do I plan to take action to support Indigenous communities? Examples of how to act include supporting Indigenous organizations by donating time and or money, supporting Indigenous-led grassroots change movements and campaigns, and committing to returning land. Local, state, and federal governments around the world are currently returning land to Indigenous people, and individuals are returning land as well. And this information comes from this Guide to Indigenous Land Acknowledgement from the Native Governance Center. And I'm not actually looking at the chat as I'm talking, but thanks to everybody who's entering in their names. I mentioned this plug at the beginning, but this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that are focused on surveys. So today we'll have these kind of the slide deck and then the activity, but the other 2 are going to be a little bit more interactive and learning from peers. On October 10th, you'll be hearing from a panel of Data for Change partners who will discuss their survey development journeys. It'll be a chance to ask questions. Really learn from some folks who are doing things on the ground. We're really excited about that. And then on November 14th, you'll have a chance to engage in peer networking to discuss surveys with other Data for Change partners. So I think we've sent out calendar invites for those 2, but you'll be getting more information shortly as those come up. And as I mentioned, we like to start with some poll questions just to get a sense of where folks are at with their survey journeys, I suppose. The first is, who do you typically survey? And I think when this pops up, it's going to be a multi-select. So select all that apply, but who are you typically serving? Clients and participants, staff, partners, others, or none? Um, and we'll wait for some results to come in. Cool. So we're seeing a fair portion of folks are saying clients and participants. A lot are also surveying their partners, maybe staff. We have some others as well. If anyone wants to pop into the chat, kind of who else they're surveying, that would be really interesting for us to see. But definitely core tends to do clients and participants, partners, sometimes staff. We do a range. I'm going to move on to the next question. How frequently do you use surveys? And there should be some response options here. Never, less than once a year, about once a year, 2 to 3 times a year, or more than 3 times a year. And the order is a little bit different from the screen and the poll itself, just FYI. All right, we're getting a lot of more than 3 times a year. So also some of the 2 to 3 or about once a year from folks who are responding. Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that we were really hoping that the survey conversation would prove useful. This is something that people are doing frequently, and maybe engaging in these conversations and these activities will help the next time that you need to do a survey. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to get us launched into the survey process.
Thanks, Claire. This is just a quick figure here that gives an overview, like a high-level overview of a survey process. The first step in the process is planning your survey. So that's both determining if a survey is the most appropriate data collection tool for the information that you're trying to gather, and then really spending some time figuring out what the goal of the information that you're trying to collect is, because I think really honing in on that purpose, I'm going to say this a few times, but honing in on that purpose can really help improve the quality of the survey process as a whole. Then you'll develop your data collection tool, making sure it aligns both with the goal and purpose of the survey, the reason why you're doing the survey, as well as the needs of the people who are going to be responding to the survey. Then you move into this distributing the survey, or the actual data collection step. And then that step, that's where you select what's going to be the most appropriate distribution method. And then finally, you collect and analyze those data, you do some interpretation and sense making, and hopefully there are maybe some decisions that are coming out of that step. And then finally, we always like to talk about bringing those data back to folks and thinking about how are you going to communicate what you learned through the survey process. Really, for the purposes of today's conversation, we're focusing on these first 3 steps, but we will lightly touch on the last 3 at the end of the presentation. So why talk about surveys? Because they are relatively cheap and quick, we all use surveys a lot. A lot of folks were saying you use surveys 3 or more times a year. Surveys can be really useful for doing things like community needs assessment, for understanding how clients and participants experience the programs that we offer. It can be useful for gathering staff and partner feedback, as lots of people talked about. We often also use surveys to try to understand the impacts of our program as well. But the really important thing is that surveys need to be done well, for the data to give you good information. I always think of the saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if we don't have a thoughtful survey process, the information, we don't know how much we can trust the information that we gather. So we want to spend some time to create really good surveys. So what types of data can you collect from a survey? Surveys are really helpful for helping you collect information about people's behavior, attributes, attitudes, opinions, perceptions. In other words, information that you could only gather by actually asking the person themselves. If you can get a more accurate measure of the thing that you're trying to measure or the information you're trying to collect in another way, a survey might not be the best choice. So the example that I thought of was like, if you're interested in maybe how food insecure families are in a particular region. Food insecurity is something that's very commonly measured. You could use a resource like Census Bureau data or American Community Survey data to sort of understand food insecurity in a particular region. But if you wanted to know something more like how do families in the neighborhood cope with food insecurity, then a survey understanding those behaviors or perceived experiences, those would be more well captured in a survey. But again, we have to remember that for a survey to collect good information, the people who you're asking the questions to need to be both willing and able to answer the questions truthfully and accurately. There's always sort of this caveat on self-reported data is that people are going to be biased, and they can be biased in the way that they answer those questions, or they might not remember accurately. So we want to create questions that are going to help facilitate us collect the right accurate information. So Claire and I put together this little decision tree of thinking about, okay, when is a survey going to be most appropriate? So always first we want to ask ourselves, can we get the measure, or can we get a measure of the characteristic in another way? If the answer is yes, we want to use those existing data. If you cannot, then you want to sort of think about what type of information are you trying to collect. Are you wanting to collect more quantitative data? Do you want to be able to like confirm or test a hypothesis? Or do you want to be able to make a more reliable conclusion about a group of people? In that case, you might be thinking about collecting quantitative data, and in that case, the survey is going to be an appropriate data collection tool. You might actually be more interested in qualitative data. Uh-oh, looks like I froze. So maybe understanding more detailed experiences or more detailed perceptions, kind of those how and why questions. And depending on the number of questions that you want to ask, say 5 or fewer questions, a survey could still be a useful data collection tool for you. If you have a broader set of questions that you're asking, that maybe is more than 5 questions, in that case, you might want to think about interviews or focus groups, a more qualitative approach, so you can really get that in-depth information that you're looking for. So again, I'm going to probably say this 8,000 times, but the overall quality of your study, of your work, of the data, really relies on the quality of the survey and the questionnaire, the questions that you're asking to collect those information. So you want to make sure that your survey asks all the right questions in the right way to the right people. As I think all of us have done some drafting of survey questions, it's pretty easy to come up with a survey question. It can take a lot of time, iteration, skill, and effort to make really good ones. So we always encourage folks to schedule in much more time on the timeline than you might think kind of at the onset of a project. And again, that planning process can really help you put together a high quality set of questions. So spending a lot of time on both determining what you want to know and creating a real clear set of goals for the survey and what you hope to do with the data that you collect. And then this like intensive prioritization process of making sure that you're sort of narrowing that set of questions to that goal that you're trying to achieve with your survey can really help sort of refine that set of questions that you're putting together. Otherwise, you might end up with a lot of questions that do not answer your needs. And you also want to be sure that the potential respondents will be able to provide the information that you would like to collect. So do they understand what you're asking? Are they even going to be willing to respond to the survey? Are they going to remember the answer? And then are they going to be willing to tell you the information that you're asking? So there's two types of questions that we ask on a survey. Everyone might be familiar with this idea already. But depending on the goals of your survey, again, you may be more inclined to ask open or qualitative questions or close-ended or more quantitative questions. Open-ended questions allow for more expression from the respondent, so you can get some more of that detailed experience or perception information and really from the perspective of the participant. But as anyone who's skipped the question, like, would you like to tell me more on this survey? It's burdensome for the respondent to answer those questions, right? We don't always want to sort of give our 3 sentences on our thought on our given experience. It also can be more difficult to analyze. So really, we encourage folks to only include open-ended questions on your survey if you have a plan or time allocated to make sure that you're going to go through and analyze and use those data. Close-ended questions, as we all know, are much easier to analyze. But again, there's some tricks of the trade there too. You want to make sure that you're offering all of the relevant response options in the list. Or again, you're not going to get the information that you need. So I have an example of a close-ended question here that's asking about factors that contribute to the level of satisfaction at your job. There's probably a lot of dimensions of things that contribute to job satisfaction. One of the things I noticed was how long your commute is, or whether or not you're able to work remotely are not things that are included on this list. So in this case, you would totally miss that in your analysis, that having a remote work from home setting or having a short commute is something that's really important to somebody's job satisfaction. So you might benefit here in this case. Sometimes that's why we include that other option, because it can be hard to create that exhaustive list. So maybe like an other option would kind of give you that mix of quant and qual, but just making sure you have the right set of response options can be one of the challenges with closed-ended questions. So where do we get our questions from? There are lots of topics that have survey questions that are commonly used and well developed. So you can think about food insecurity, depression, physical activity, and some of those questions and topic areas are more readily accessible than others. This might not be a set of questions that you all ever ask about, but I know like questions that ask about medication adherence are notoriously difficult to get a hold of. They usually require some sort of licensing process, so you have to like sign up and you have to often pay fees. And I think there are some other measures that folks use that do require fees in that licensing process. Using existing measures can be really helpful. If you're thinking about sort of generating evidence, sometimes with our programs, we want to be able to say what we're doing is sort of like has an evidence base to it. And in that case, using existing measures can be helpful for sort of comparing with other work that has been done, or for kind of giving some validity to the conclusions of the evidence base that you're trying to build. Oftentimes, you might find that you're not able to find existing measures or things that are appropriate for the groups that you're working with. And so in that case, you might decide to write your own questions. Across both approaches, it is extremely helpful and valuable to talk to people who either know the topic area well or are potential respondents to really gauge if those questions that you're selecting are going to be a good fit for the people that you're trying to collect that information from. If you are writing your own questions, don't worry, there's lots of resources out there on how to put together and write some really high quality questions. These are some kind of general rules that exist around writing your own questions. You know, you want to think about making sure you're using simple, clear language. Again, coming back to that goal or purpose of the survey and making sure that the survey questions you're writing and including really align with that purpose. You want to think about cognitive load. So making sure that the survey is as easy, simple, seamless for the respondent to move through so that they're not sort of like having to use, they're not going to get frustrated or have to use up too much brain space to sort of answer the survey. You just want to make sure that it's easy to move through. You want to make sure that you're sort of being really clear about the terms that you're using and making sure you define things, because you know what satisfaction means to me or support means to me might look different for you. You want to make sure you're trying to avoid bias, right? So you don't want to sort of tip your hand or make people sort of think in one way or the other. And also you want to remember that people want to reflect their best selves in the process. So they may not always respond to sensitive questions, and that could be about things like drug use, sexuality potentially, things around racism and bias. Those types of things might be harder for people to answer. Even things like income, I think, is notoriously hard to capture. This slide here often offers some common pitfalls that come up when writing survey questions. So this comes to that, what I was talking about before with making sure you're using clearly defined language, so unclear wording here. Do you support community health? I think both of these terms, what do you mean by community health? What does that mean for you and your organization? And what do you mean by support? Does that mean believe in, participate, fund? So you want to be really specific about the terms that you're using, because what it means for you may not be interpreted the same way for the participant. And this is another one that comes up a lot. We call it double-barreled questions, or asking two questions at once. So having an "and" in your survey question might be a big hint for this one. The example here is, do you receive food and rent support from this organization? So if a respondent receives one and not the other, how should they respond to that question? It can be a little bit confusing. And then this built-in bias. So the question is worded in such a way that it influences how a respondent might answer. So the example here talks about how more Americans exercise regularly. With this sort of like first sentence, more Americans exercise regularly now than they did 10 years ago. And so you may not want to say like, I never exercise, because now you're like, everyone exercises, so I want to exercise too. So you just want to make sure that you're that can like set up a respondent to not maybe answer accurately. There's also some clarity of terms there that you could think about. Okay. And these are some common pitfalls with response options. So one of these is this idea of unbalanced choices, right? You can see we have a do not agree here, and then we have two agree options. So there's like more opportunities for a respondent to say that they agree than disagree. And we just want to make sure that it's sort of balanced on either side, so we're not sort of nudging the participant to respond in a particular way. Sometimes it can be difficult to calculate, right? So this one is like a funny question, but how many times did you buy coffee for yourself in the last year? So unless you're a person who buys it every day or a person who never buys it, this can be a really hard question to answer. So you could think about response options to say like, oh, I buy probably about like once a week or once a month, and that could help the person remember. Or you could think about a different way that you might want to ask that question. This one is a little bit tricky, but this idea that the response options are what we would call are not mutually exclusive. So this question here that's provided is, how long have you owned your product? Less than a year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, or more than 5 years? If I was a person who had owned my product for 3 years, I'm not sure if I should respond to B or C, right? Three is offered in both categories, so it's a little bit unclear to me as a respondent which of those I'm meant to select. And so you would sort of get confusion. You know, some people are going to respond with B and some people are going to run with C, and you're kind of going to miss that group of who have owned it for 3 years. And then the other one is not exhaustive, and this kind of goes back to that example that I was talking about with job satisfaction, right? It doesn't include the response options that you list, don't sort of include the list for how a respondent could potentially respond. So this is how often do you visit this particular organization? This is my first time, 1 time per year, 1 time per month, 1 time per week, and then daily. Now, if I were a person who often comes twice a week, I'm not daily, but I'm also not 1 time per week. So there's not an option really that I fit into as a person responding to the survey. When thinking about demographics, it's always good to let folks sort of self-identify, especially things like race, gender, sexual orientation. And open-ended questions, again, allow for more information, especially if that's something that's of particular interest to your organization and some information that you're planning to sort of do something with. And again, the same thing, but if you don't have the capacity, you might want to go back to sort of close-ended questions, which are going to be easier for you all to analyze. And this is a place too where you might consider how comparable the data is to publicly available data sources. There are things like census categories, or OHA now is using the Real D. Maybe you want to be able to sort of say something about the group you're working with relative to census or to demographic data in the community. And so you may want to collect the data in the same way that those groups do so that your data are comparable. When thinking about the order that you want to ask your questions in, generally you want to start off easy. You don't get people excited like, oh, I got this. And then it can get a little bit more challenging and ask your harder questions as the survey goes on. Often we ask our sort of boring, who are you demographic questions at the end. And that can also sort of help with some bias things potentially. And then you might ask your open-ended, any other comments, questions at the very end. You can also think about question order in terms of bias. So maybe you're asking both about sexual orientation or sexuality, and you want to know about sexual violence as well. And you may not want to like sort of preface the sexual violence questions before the sexuality questions, because it may be sort of indirectly sort of giving the sense that sexuality is bad. So you just want to think about like how the order of the questions might influence the way a person would respond to them. And then it's always good, you know, one thing I encourage all of the groups, Data for Change groups that I'm working with when they're creating a survey is like, can you get a version of this survey in front of someone similar to who you expect to respond to the survey? Because there's lots of things, like we can spend a lot of time iterating, you know, using our best words and semantics to like craft these like very nice questions, but it is really helpful to get it in front of someone who's going to respond to the survey, because they can point out things that don't make sense, things that mean different things to them than they do to you, and really provide some clarity on that questionnaire. And then if you're thinking about evidence building, you may want to look and spend some time understanding where the survey measures, with whom the survey measures have been validated with before. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that today, but if that is a question for you, I think any of the core folks could spend some more time talking to you about that if that's of interest. Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. So Sarah went through the first 2 stages, that planning of the survey, then creating the survey instrument, and now you've got the instrument created and you want to distribute it. So we'll be talking about that 3rd stage in the process. Get the next slide. Oh, if you want to, sorry. Awesome. So there are a few different ways that you can, distribute your survey. When you're planning it, you can kind of choose ahead of time which method you're going to use. There's mail, phone, face-to-face interviews, handouts where maybe you're at an event and you have a clipboard and you're going around and kind of distributing the survey, and then email or web-based surveys. Each method obviously has its own advantages and disadvantages. There's some considerations around, what's your survey content, responding characteristics, timeline, what are your available resources, and all of these can help you select the most appropriate method. Want to go to the next slide? So here are just some initial pros and cons on each of the ones that I just mentioned. There are obviously, more in each category. If you're thinking about mail, it might be more comfortable for some folks to do kind of a paper survey, something that's been mailed to them, compared to an electronic survey. On the other hand, it might not be as accessible for populations who don't have a home address. So those are kind of the advantages and disadvantages there. When it comes to doing a handout, you don't need an email address, you don't need a home address or a phone number, but it also might be difficult in determining, where are you going to be distributing this? How are you going to be finding folks and handing it out to them? When it comes to kind of those email or web-based surveys, one thing that it allows is skip logic, and that's where you ask a question, and if the question is not applicable for folks, you don't ask the next three questions if they're all kind of, hinged on that first question. So way back to our poll questions, if you answered, I don't ever, do surveys, you wouldn't get that, how frequently do you do them question that, kind of the answer was in that first question. So it allows for the skip logic. It's more cost effective, but it may not be as accessible for some populations. You also are going to need the email addresses if that's how you're distributing it. When it comes to face-to-face surveys, again, it's allowing for that skip logic. And it might be better for open-ended questions if you have someone who's kind of recording the answer. On the other hand, sensitive questions may feel more uncomfortable. Some folks may feel better, kind of writing it down on a piece of paper than saying it to a person. They're also much more expensive or resource intensive. Same thing with phone. Again, allows for skip logic, might be better for open-ended, more expensive or resource intensive, and that same issue with sensitive questions. There are also kind of like some fun or quicker ways to do surveys. You can try a flash survey where you're getting really brief information, maybe 1 to 3 questions using a phone or a tablet. You can use kind of really easily recognizable words or maybe symbols, smiley face, neutral face, sad face. The example that always comes to mind for me is when you're in the airport and the bathrooms always have the "How was your experience?" and it has the 3 smiley faces or the 3 faces. So it's just a way to get some quick answers. That's an example. Want to go to the next slide? And this is just some additional information on paper surveys, kind of when you would want to use them and some tips. Sometimes using paper and pen can be better if you're trying to survey participants at an event and getting all the responses. If you don't have things like email addresses, when you just have a couple quick questions to ask folks. And that leads into some of the tips, which is it's really nice if you're doing a paper survey to kind of have it maybe front or back, just 1 to 2 pages maximum. Making it as easy to read as possible, putting spaces between the questions. If you're kind of giving out these paper surveys in person, there's an opportunity to offer support for folks who are unable to read. You are going to do some manual data entry, though, if you're doing it on paper, which is going to add in some time and potential kind of human error as you're transferring from paper into whatever, Excel, or if you have some sort of software. And then another tip or trick is to assign a survey ID to make sure that the surveys are confidential, anonymous, but you can still kind of track all the answers together. Get to the next slide. And then obviously something that we run into a lot is, or at least CORE runs into a lot, is response rate issues. You really want to increase those as much as you can. And here are just a couple of ways that you can do that. You can get respondent buy-in by providing clear information kind of around the research goal or how the data will be used. So being really explicit around, the reason that we're fielding this survey is because of this. This is how we're going to be using the responses. Maybe we're, going to improve the program that you're engaged in. And then being clear around what you're asking of the respondent, saying, we think this will be a 10 to 15 minute survey or a 5 to 10 minute survey, and being honest around that. Also ensuring confidentiality, and the slide deck disappeared, but at least it did for me. I don't know if it did for others.
We can still see it.
Oh, okay, cool. Ensuring confidentiality and telling your respondents that you will keep their identities confidential right up front. You can also provide a clear timeline, so sending advance notice, maybe before you send the survey, hey, this is coming, giving a clear deadline, we need it by this date. Also, reminders can be really helpful if you just send out kind of an email saying, here's the link again, if you want to engage. Making the surveys accessible and engaging, so limiting the numbers of questions that you ask is something that we've touched on. Not making it too hard to complete, and like Sarah mentioned before, giving respondents something interesting to answer early in the survey. Also, it really helps to consider giving a small incentive. So maybe $2, $5 cash stipends could increase response rates, especially if you're paying before the survey begins. Cash tends to be best, but you can also offer in-kind services or gift cards or bus tickets, things like that. And you can also offer to share results, which goes back to the dissemination part of the process, which we'll touch on at the very end. But those are the first kind of 3 steps in the process, and now we wanted to break quickly to do an activity. So I'll hand it briefly back to Sarah to describe. Great. So when you're about to start analyzing your data, you can define your objectives. What are you trying to learn is going to kind of affect how you start poking at the data, what questions you're asking of the data. And these are going to link back to planning and creating your survey. You'll probably have something that you want to learn when you are putting the survey out into the field, or information that you feel that you need to give back to folks or to funders or to any other interested parties. And so that will help kind of form your analysis. There's that cleaning your data stage where you're transforming your raw data into something usable. We talked about skip coding, things like that will, maybe affect what your data looks like, and just accounting for that before you move into analyzing individual responses. Something that you could do at this point is separate out the quantitative and qualitative questions, summarize each, kind of give a description of what you found on each. We pointed out here with the qualitative questions, we've mentioned a couple of times, only asking what you have the capacity to analyze. So if you do have a whole bunch of qualitative questions, like we saw in the activity, one of those surveys really had a whole bunch of open-ended questions. Are you going to have the capacity to go in and sort through those and do the coding or the analysis? And that's something to think about before you actually get to the end. If you go to your next slide. Getting into the interpretation of the data, this is where you can identify patterns and trends, looking to see especially how responses might differ across groups. Probably even at the planning stages, you have populations or groups that you're particularly interested in. Are they having a differential experience of the program? So you can identify folks at the beginning based on race or ethnicity, language, family structure, anything that you might think is affecting, kind of how your program is going. And then you can look at those responses. It's also an opportunity to understand surprising findings. You can consider using member checking, where you're bringing back the information that you got to community members to try to understand why you're seeing what you're seeing. And this is a way to link to a qualitative step in the study, maybe ask more questions, get into more depth. Next slide. And then decision-making and dissemination. What are you going to do with the findings? Again, I said with the purpose, there's probably a reason that you're fielding this. And, is it to make program changes or improvements? Can you do that based on the information that you've got? So consider your findings in terms of your original goals. And then dissemination, what do you want to report on? Who do you need to do outreach to? Are you going to give the information back to the folks that you surveyed? Are you going to be sharing it with other people, other interested parties? And considering multiple methods of dissemination, just like considering multiple methods of doing surveys. Different folks have, different levels of comfort with different ways of having it disseminated. So that can be something to consider. And that, if you go just to our final slide, is a really quick overview of all the kind of steps in the process. We have our 2 other survey or webinars coming up. And if you want to complete our survey, that would be really helpful. We do collect this feedback, and we do analyze it and use it for future webinars. So if you have a moment to do that, it would be really helpful. We're also really looking forward to seeing everyone again with our October and November webinars, where we can have a conversation and ask folks questions and really kind of delve into the survey processes. But thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate you turning out.